For some reason, I'm not on. Testing. Hello? 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 Testing. Testing. All right, why don't we get started? We have a great speaker today, and want to leave good time for questions. Let me first of all, how many of you in the class got to see the end of the movie? All right. So now, for you, those of you who didn't know, okay, I should have asked the other question. How many didn't see the end of the movie? Okay. Are we going to leave a copy in the Resource Center? AV? Levy Library. So you can check out, see what you missed. And Ken Carlson, the producer, will come back next Wednesday, and we'll have a discussion for all the different issues from vomiting at parties to God's relation to football. Okay? So let me say something about, and this fits for our visitors, but for the class, today's talk fits in nicely where we're supposed to be. Because as you know, we have some readings about how news has been dumbed down, particularly local television news, the Joni London piece and others, and whether electronic media can really be useful and so forth. And then, of course, we get into a lot of issues of what's happened to reporting in the sense that it stresses personalities, gossip, and so forth. We are fortunate today to have a true legend, but also a functioning newsman in Jack Nelson. And I'm not going to read all the biographical stuff, but what's interesting to me about Jack Nelson is he comes out of he's one of a number of, maybe he'll talk about this, Southern liberals, in the old sense of Southern liberals, who came out of the whole era of the civil rights movement and covering it and so forth. Howell Raines is another one at the New York Times. There are many others who became a real force in American media, American politics, American writing, and brought a whole perspective. So he was in the South as a native Southerner, covered the civil rights movement, covered events in the South, won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of a mental institution and issues involved, and has spent most of his career at the Los Angeles Times and in Washington as the chief of the Los Angeles Times Washington Bureau, and he's also a regular on NPR's Washington Week in Review, where some of you may know Jack. But I think it's fair to say he's covered every president from Nixon on up, and I think it's fair to say, without prejudice, that he's, if not the most distinguished Washington correspondent since James Reston. He's certainly one of the two or three. You could have an argument, but there are very few people who wouldn't tell you that Jack Nelson for the last decades has been one of maybe the number one or number two, three top people known for objectivity, known for being insightful, known for being tough but fair, and the best of what print media has to offer, and then combining it with these appearances on television. I do also want to mention he's here as, Nate Monaster Writer-in-Residence, available in some of the classes and so forth. And his wife, who knows a lot about the electronic side and can tell us much, Barbara Matasso, who is here, is also appearing in classes and giving lectures. And she's very well known, particularly as the author of The Evening Stars, The Making of Network News, of a Network News Anchor. So she has the whole other perspective of what's gone on in national television reporting. I know many of you are interested in that, either because you might want to be anchors or because you want to write critically about what's happened in television, or you want to run a network someday. So she can tell you how to run a network someday, and she's here. We have a reception after in which we all get a chance to meet with these people thanks to the Annenberg program. And so there are free refreshments and so forth, and that's upstairs. So please stick around for the reception part after talk. So, Jack Nelson.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that very generous introduction. Bob mentioned that I'd won a Pulitzer Prize. I did that back when I was a very young man, when I was about 30 years old, and I had a 6-year-old son. and he wrote an essay on his father entitled My Dad. He said, my dad was a porter, P-O-R-T-E-R, for the Atlanta Constitution, C-O-N-S-T-O-O-O-S-H-I-N. He won a Pulitzer Prize, P-U-L-I-T, S-U-P-R-I-Z-E. He makes $50 a week, and he was proud of it. And he wasn't very far along on the salary in those days, I can tell you that. Journalists are much better paid today. Well, now that he's president, people are asking how much of the kind of bipartisanship that George Bush has promised us that we'll see. And my guess is not very much, despite his charm offensive and his outreach to Democrats. My wife, Barbara, who Bob mentioned, was at Washington Museum the other night. She was moderating a panel of reporters talking about the 2000 election. And the reporters talked about the bitterness of the campaign, and both during the campaign and in its aftermath. And after the program, a little lady in her 80s walked up to me and handed me a crumpled sheet of paper. She was a Democrat, and it contained a poem she said her husband, a Democrat and staunch supporter of Adlai Stevenson, had written in November 1952, right after Dwight Eisenhower had defeated Stevenson. And the Democrat's poem was addressed to my Republican friends, and this is the way it read. The election is over, the result now known. The will of people had clearly been shown. Let's forget all quarrels and show by deeds that we will give Ike all the help that he needs. Let's all get together, let bitterness pass. I'll hug your elephant, you kiss my ass. Seriously, while partisanship has always been part of our system, there have been some dramatic changes in politics and in the way politics is covered in my 31 years in Washington. Not all of these changes have been for the better. I'm going to offer some thoughts on what lies behind some of the things that many of us don't like about the way politics and media coverage have changed. Unfortunately, I've had a ringside seat to watch every president and every presidential campaign candidate since Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey, and to Bill Clinton and Bob Dole and Al Gore and George W. Bush. When I first came to Washington, the streets of the Capitol were filled with anti-Vietnam War protesters and sometimes with tear gas. Some areas of Washington had only recently been destroyed by the riots following the Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. And Watergate, the most serious political scandal in U.S. history, was about to begin. But for all of that turmoil, the political game today is much meaner, much more bitterly partisan than it was back then. And the press coverage, while much better in some respects, has become much more sensational, based on lowered standards and entertainment value, with much more emphasis on fights than policy. Much of the mainstream media has been polluted with erroneous stories, many that emanated from the internet, and they led to unsubstantiated allegations against many political leaders, including the President of the United States. One result of all of this is that politics in Washington is now almost completely devoid of levity. And believe me, I think we could use some of the humor of some of our past presidents and presidential candidates. Whether you liked Ronald Reagan or not, and whether you liked his policies or not, you had to laugh at some of his one-liners. Remember, it was Reagan who said, when you get in bed with the government, you get more than a good night's sleep. Some of the Reagan's liberal critics might say that when Reagan was in the White House for 8 years, it was the government that got more than a good night's sleep. There's also Reagan who said the vice presidency reminded him of an old rule of dog sledding. Only the lead dog gets a change of scenery. The late Mo Udall, the Arizona congressman who ran for the Democratic nomination in 1976, was well known for self-effacing humor. After Jimmy Carter soundly beat him for the nomination, Udall said, "I wanted to run for president in the worst way, and I did." And so did Al Gore, but I can't imagine him ever saying that. Jimmy Carter's humor, when he showed any, was rather biting and other-directed rather than self-effacing. Once during the 1976 campaign, a reporter asked him, "Why don't you use self-deprecating humor and poke fun at yourself, like Mo Udall does?" Carter, and I knew Carter quite well. I'd covered him when he was a state senator and when he was governor. But he narrowed those steely blue eyes of his and he told a reporter, "If I was the father of the Postal Service like Mo Udall, I'd have plenty to be self-deprecatory about." Except for John McCain, we didn't hear much humor of any kind from the 2000 presidential candidates. McCain, when asked about rumors he was unstable and having a bad temper, he said, "Anybody has to be half nuts to run for president." It was McCain who said George W. Bush was born on third base and thought he hit a triple. And at a forum where McCain was the last of a long line of speakers, he said, so many speakers came before him, I feel like Zsa Zsa Gabor's fifth husband. I know what to do, but I don't know how to make it interesting. But some of the candidates seemed almost afraid of humor, especially if it might be aimed at them, and some of it on the internet was. The Bush campaign went to a lot of trouble to buy up and control all the internet domain names that might be used to poke fun at George W. The campaign bought up about 200 names in all, including GeorgeBushBlows.com and GeorgeBushSucks.org. One cyber agitator did manage to register the name GWBush.com, and it carried such slogans as drug-free since 1974 and hypocrisy with bravado. George W. was not amused. He brought legal action against the programmer, denounced him as a garbage man, and declared there ought to be limits to freedom. Other political candidates also were skewered on parody websites. www.algore2000.org had an official-looking letter from Vice President Gore that said, working against the American people, we have sparked moral decay across our country. And a headline on www.hillaryknow.com said, U.S. Senate for proven leaders, not a proving ground. Well, private citizens poking fun at politicians is nothing new, of course. Americans have always made jokes about their elected leaders. Will Rogers once said the only way you ought to look at a politician is down. I think that's much too extreme, of course, and I've known many politicians I respect, even some I've looked up to and liked. Of the 6 presidents I've covered, I've liked all except one. But people making fun of politicians is not the same thing as politicians making fun of themselves. And the decline in the latter and the kind of humor that Mo Udall turned on himself, I think is an important change. And it's not a change for the better. Politicians' sense of humor, their ability to take a joke about themselves and to make a joke about themselves, is a sign of a healthy democracy. It means leaders understand that they're human, that they can be wrong or make a mistake. And when the political system loses its sense of humor, that's usually a sign that officials are becoming too arrogant and proud and too sure that they alone know what is right. Washington has experienced too much of that. Some might say that liberals were that way in the Vietnam era. Now the ideological conservatives on the far right are the ones filled with moral certainty. They don't just see issues in black and white, but in terms of right and wrong. And they want to do more than win policy battles. They want to destroy their opponents. Compromise is the lifeblood of politics in a country as large and diverse as ours. It's been a crucial factor in the process, given that there's always been a knockdown, drag-out quality to Washington politics. For too many years on Capitol Hill, though, compromise often has been disdained, and that has engendered much more bitterness and hard feelings than in the past. A steady trend toward unbending partisanship can be traced back to the Vietnam era and the impeachment of Nixon, and it's caused some veteran legislators to finally throw in the towel. Among them were Senators David Warren, Democrat of Oklahoma, and Danforth, Republican of Missouri. And in an op-ed page column, the senators wrote this: with each passing year, fewer members of Congress are willing to work with their colleagues in the opposing party. Those who do are met with increasing criticism and suspicion in their own party caucuses. The culmination of this 20-year trend was passage of the budget without a single vote in Congress from the opposition party. Party and partisanship have become more important than policy and partnership. The dramatic change in the level of bitterness and narrow partisanship, I think, is seen most clearly in 2 presidential impeachment movements that I covered: the successful effort to force Nixon from office 26 years ago and the failed effort to remove Clinton. And I want to briefly discuss the differences between those proceedings because I think it says a lot about the changing state of politics in America. Like Clinton, Nixon was a hated figure in some quarters. The difference was that opposition to Nixon rested chiefly on political and legal grounds and on abuses of power and the moral issue of the Vietnam War. It was not about his private life or personal morals. Missing from Watergate was the personal loathing that ran through much of the harshest criticism of Clinton. The difference is important because many Americans find it relatively easy to draw a distinction between an elected official's public actions and his private conduct. As a result, where Nixon's actions of obstructing justice and other abuses of power were universally seen as proper matters for congressional scrutiny, many Americans felt from the beginning that Clinton's actions were not. Those public doubts about the basic legitimacy of the Clinton inquiry were reinforced by the partisan atmosphere that surrounded it. During Watergate, the Democratic leaders who controlled the majorities in both the House and Senate went to great lengths to establish working relationships with leaders of the Republican minority. They created an atmosphere as free from narrow partisanship as possible. They knew that otherwise their actions would lack credibility and boomerang. And of course there was partisan feeling. But leaders in both parties were determined to at least appear to rise above it, and they did. At the beginning of Watergate, a Senate committee was named to investigate, and a shrewd old Democratic senator from North Carolina, Sam Ervin, teamed up with a rising young Republican senator from Tennessee, Howard Baker. It wasn't easy, but together they produced nationally televised hearings that riveted the nation and gave all sides a chance to be heard in a relatively judicious atmosphere. Later, when the House Judiciary Committee took up the question of impeachment, Chairman Peter Rodino of New Jersey worked to assure Republican support from start to finish. When Rodino's committee considered whether or not to take up impeachment, the vote to do so was unanimous. When Chairman Henry Hyde's Judiciary Committee voted to take up impeachment of President Clinton, that vote was strictly along party lines. When the final Watergate vote came, the articles of impeachment commanded a solid bipartisan majority in the committee. By contrast, Hyde's committee voted to impeach Clinton, and it was split along bitterly partisan lines. Even before the Hyde committee voted on impeachment, the handling of independent counsel Kenneth Starr's evidence was in stark contrast with what happened during Watergate. Starr made a big media splash by delivering 36 boxes of evidence to Congress with television cameras alerted to record it for the evening news. Hyde's committee released to the public thousands of pages of extremely explicit grand jury testimony and other evidence, much of it uncorroborated, plus Clinton's video testimony and raw FBI files the law normally keeps secret. Starr's report bristled with accusations and conclusions, plus an argument for impeachment. By contrast, Watergate Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski sent his report to Congress quietly. Everything fit in a single brown leather briefcase. It included White House tapes and transcripts and index and what Jaworski called a roadmap for Congress. Jaworski, unlike Starr, made no recommendations on impeachment. In fact, he pointedly noted that the Constitution leaves impeachment solely to the discretion of Congress. Rodino's committee conducted its early deliberations behind closed doors and kept evidence under lock and key until the committee began its formal debate on articles of impeachment. In Clinton's case, Henry Hyde had said from the beginning that impeachment would have no credibility without bipartisanship, and he was right. Once impeachment became virtually a partisan effort, with 13 white Republican males serving as the prosecutors, it was clear Clinton would survive and much of the public would view him as the target of a Republican lynch mob. One might ask why these changes in politics have occurred, and how do they relate to other changes in modern politics, for example, reliance on public opinion polls, the growing importance of huge fundraising operations, and increasing use of the Internet. Well, many factors are involved, of course. New technologies that find their way into other parts of American life usually find their way into politics as well. Sophisticating advertising techniques, image making, even the use of fax machine and the cell phone. And also, some of what makes politics today so sharp-edged is that we've been going through a period of increased political involvement by churches and religious groups. That's something that has waxed and waned in American history, and it seems to be waxing big time in the Bush-Cheney administration. The founding fathers tried to build a wall between church and state because they knew how divisive religious controversy could be and how it could undermine the First Amendment. And those of you old enough, and those of you who have studied history enough, may remember that one of the obstacles to John F. Kennedy's election was fear that as president he might take orders from the Pope. Kennedy laid those fears to rest, but they reflected the sensitivity of the issue. Today, because of the controversy over abortion and other social issues like prayer in schools, religious leaders openly campaign for policies and candidates. They have every right to do so, as they did in fighting for Senate confirmation of John Ashcroft to be Attorney General. But when public issues are cast in religious terms, being for God or against God, then fights can turn ugly and deeply divisive. Another factor that has dramatically changed politics in the past few decades is the decline of traditional political organizations, the disappearance of machine politics and old-fashioned bosses. When I was a young reporter in the South, every town and county had its democratic organization, often represented by an all-powerful judge or the local mayor or sheriff. The same was true in the nation's big cities. Chicago had its Mayor Daley, the original Richard J. Daley, not his more reform-minded son, the mayor of Chicago today. One may say that those old machines were corrupt, and we're better off without them. And corruption certainly was a problem. As an investigative reporter for the Atlanta Constitution in the 1950s, I found amazing examples of corruption in Georgia. The state of Georgia literally purchased boats with no bottoms for lakes with no water. Payments were made for paving highways that didn't exist. The state mental hospital had staff doctors who had alcoholic or drug addiction problems, some of them hired off of the hospital's own ward. All these and other terrible abuses went on with little political opposition to challenge them. Similar scandals existed in other parts of the country, of course. And throughout the country, entrenched political organizations helped keep segregation and racial discrimination alive for decades. There was another side to those old machines, though. They provided a kind of stability that we don't have today in our politics. Because the organizations could deliver votes for their chosen candidates on election day, there was a high level of party loyalty and discipline among elected officials, especially members of Congress. Sam Rayburn, the Texas Democrat who was House Speaker during the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, used to tell new members of Congress to get along, go along. That wasn't always the popular will, but it did mean that when tough issues came along, elected officials had some protection if they cast an unpopular vote. The organization may not be able to completely thwart the will of the people if they were really stirred up, but it could promise the politician he would not face voters alone in taking an unpopular stand. Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Congress for authority just before the beginning of World War II, for instance, to institute a military draft if needed. Trouble with Japan was brewing in the Pacific, and Hitler was already making war in Europe. For Roosevelt and many others, the time had come to prepare for the worst. But isolationism was strong in the country at that time, and so voting for the draft was unpopular. The bill passed the House by a single vote, and many an uneasy congressman went along with the president in part because he knew the Democratic Party would help him survive the next election. Today, the situation is completely different. Parties are weak and political machines are dead. Bribery and other forms of direct corruption are much less common. Individual politicians are much freer to speak and vote as they wish, and voters are more independent too. But the downside to the demise of the strong party organizations is that it contributes to some of the things we don't like about today's political system. We have replaced machine politics with the politics of the individual. Today, elected officials know they can rely on nobody but themselves to get reelected. So they spend inordinate amounts of time thinking about how to position themselves and trying to raise enough money for the next election. And when a tough issue like the draft or Social Security or prison sentence for drug users comes along, it's every politician looking out for number one. So you might ask what's wrong with that. Well, for one thing, it's vastly increased the importance of raising huge amounts of campaign money. If you have to sell yourself directly to voters, you must use television and other mass communication. That takes millions of dollars for state contests and over $100 million for presidential campaigns. The only place to get that much money is from special interests, and people who give usually expect something in return, and they usually get it. Jimmy Carter once told me after he had been president for about 2 years that he had been dismayed upon coming to Washington to find that the most powerful force in the city, more powerful than the media and any of the three branches of government, was special interests. The issue of special interests and campaign money has only grown worse since that time. The 2000 election cost an estimated $3 billion for the presidential and congressional races and another $1 billion or more on state contests. George W. Bush raked in a mind-boggling $100 million plus for his primary campaign alone. And the huge amount of campaign funds seems destined to only grow in the years ahead unless McCain's campaign finance bill passes. The public shows little interest in paying for campaigns with tax money. But a question I think we all face is whether public financing ultimately costs us less than the present system in which special interest financed campaigns then claim an IOU from the winners. The politics of the individual has also fueled the rise of political consultants and image makers who focus on manipulating the media. Folks in Washington snickered when it was reported that Al Gore was paying a consultant to help him convince voters he's an alpha male. Part of the strategy was to start wearing brown suit. You hate to think that the leader of the free world will be chosen on the basis of what color suit he wears. Well, there's really nothing unusual about what Gore did. Every candidate for national office, and most statewide candidates too, use consultants, and most of them are every bit as manipulative as Gore's consultant. In fact, although politics is freer and more open in some ways than it used to be, the treatment of serious issues is often more cynical and shallow than it ever was. The essence of modern campaigning is to find issues and images that make you appeal to as broad a range of voters as possible in a 30-second soundbite. Look at crime. For serious crime, rates for serious crime have been going down for several years, and violent crime has never posed a serious threat to the vast majority of people. But almost everyone is worried about it, especially if asked by a poll taker. So it's been a perfect issue for politicians to shout about and for the press to write about. One result is that huge numbers of young black males now have criminal records, which is causing big problems for the African American community and for all of us in the long run. A big part of the reason for all these new criminals is that politicians in Washington and elsewhere want to sound tough on crime without offending likely voters. And so they make the penalties much tougher for involvement with crack than for powdered cocaine. Crack, of course, is used primarily by poor African Americans. Powdered cocaine is used by middle class and upper class whites. Under present law, the amount of crack that lands you in serious trouble is much, much smaller than the amount of coke. In my book, that's unequal justice, and today's politics is one reason it exists. Not only have politicians exploited the issues, but others have gone along because of fear of being labeled soft on drugs. A related consequence of declining political parties is the rising importance of single-issue voting blocks. Winning votes one at a time is expensive and chancy, so politicians look for blocks they can appeal to. Issue groups, anti-abortionists, environmentalists, religious conservatives, even groups of people concerned about the influence of all these groups. While business interests give money, they can't deliver votes. Single-issue blocks have members who care enough to go to the polls and to work for a candidate beforehand. Appealing to such single-interest blocks is especially tempting at a time when voter turnout is declining and voter apathy seems to be rising. The problem with single-issue politics, though, is that it can distort the public agenda and polarize debate. It leads to litmus tests and prevents compromise. One reason political rhetoric has been so extreme and politics so nasty is that politicians try to whip up enthusiasm among the issue groups by throwing them plenty of red meat. Another sign of politicians' search for new ways to reach voters and build support is the growing importance of the Internet. Candidates not only have their own websites, they solicit campaign contributions on the Internet. The Republican Party built the first nationwide Internet political community through establishment of GOPnet.com. The service revolutionized the way Republican supporters stay connected with the party. By pushing a button, the party is able to communicate with hundreds of thousands of people while providing many features designed to keep Republicans informed and engaged in party activities. Voter.com is another sign of how the Internet is working its way into politics. It allows voters to fill out e-questionnaires and search for the candidates they agree with the most. On another site, politics.com, voters can plug in their zip codes and search Federal Election Commission records to identify campaign donors. And as more and more people become connected, the Internet may offer politicians a way to talk directly to millions of people for free without the huge expense of buying television time. But politics on the World Wide Web will be plagued by the same problem that exists with applications of the Internet. For one thing, it's dazzling technology, but it's virtual reality. It's not a very good substitute for actual give and take between candidates. But if candidates find they can reach voters through the Internet, they will have less incentive to campaign face-to-face. And as some students have discovered in using the net for research, while there's a lot of good information out there, there's also a lot of bad information. A website or chat room can be manipulated, even simulated by hoaxers. The Internet is a perfect vehicle for spreading gossip, rumors, hoaxes, and other disinformation. A friend of mine recently told me about the experience his 12-year-old son and a friend of his had on the internet. They got into a chat room for teenagers and a virtual romance developed, and someone self-described as a competitive swimmer and a cheerleader at her school was corresponding with them, and pretty soon the two boys were quarreling over whose girlfriend she was. It never occurred to them that these alluring messages might not be coming from a teenage girl at all. Imagine that story applied to politics. Well, good and bad information also is true of polling. And the media increasingly relies on polling. Hardly anyone likes the increasing role of public opinion polls in shaping what political leaders do and say. And there are signs of public resistance to polling. A growing number of those asked to take part now refuse to do so. Yet the importance of polls is likely to rise. In the old days, politicians in Washington kept their fingers on the voters' pulse by talking to political bosses around the country. Today, with those bosses gone, politicians rely on polls. In an age of independent voters and independent candidates, polling lets politicians and their handlers delve deep into how the public feels and devise strategies that exploit those feelings. President Clinton apparently decided not to make a clean breast of the Monica Lewinsky scandal when it first broke, because a poll by his advisor, Dick Morris, showed that voters would turn against him if he confessed. Instead of telling the truth, Clinton lied and played for time, hoping public hostility would soften and his enemies would overplay their hand. And he was right on all counts. Talking about the dying political establishment, when I think about it, Jimmy Carter may have been the first president to get himself elected by shunning it. And he did it all by himself. He started early, he worked like a dog and was meticulously organized. I remember when he came up to the Washington Bureau of the Los Angeles Times for a breakfast session when he was still running as governor, and his identification in the country was less than 1%. And he started telling how he was going to run for president and how he was going to win in Iowa in the Iowa caucus. And nobody had won in the Iowa caucus before. The Iowa caucus wasn't considered important. And he told us he was, at that time, chairman of the Congressional Campaign Committee, and he had gone all around the country building up grassroots support, staying at local politicians' homes and so forth. And as he talked about how he was going to run, people in our bureau, eyes started going to the ceiling, particularly our political reporters. Nobody thought he had a chance. Then he later was out in Los Angeles, and he told Otis Chandler, the publisher, and some of the editors at a luncheon how he was going to run the same way. And once again, the eyes went to the ceiling. And after the lunch was over, Otis Chandler told Carter that, he said, "Governor, if you're going to be out here next year, we'd like to have you come by for lunch again." And Carter right away said, "I'll be out here again next year, 13 days. And Ed Guthman, one of your journalism professors here now, who was the national editor at the time, was at that lunch, and as we walked out, he said, if he knows that he's going to be out here for 13 days next year, I'd take him seriously. He was the first person I ever heard to take Jimmy Carter seriously as a presidential campaign, but one reason he took him so seriously was he really did work hard for it, and he did buck against the establishment. But once Carter got elected, he seemed to forget the lessons of his own success. He concentrated on having perfect policy proposals, not on selling himself. Democrats had majorities in both houses of Congress. Carter apparently thought that he would assure adoption of his policies even though he scorned members of Congress. "They waste my time," he told me one time. "I know more about the issues than they do." In an era of self-propelled politicians, the congressional Democrats didn't need Carter, and they cheerfully thwarted him to serve their own ends. Ronald Reagan, though much older than Carter and not nearly as brainy, was more of a modern politician. To win elections and have power in office, he knew, he had to sell himself to voters personally, not count on the Republican Party. He unabashedly used his acting skills and warm personality to do that. Washington insiders sneered at Reagan's reliance on cue cards, but voters didn't care. They liked and they trusted him, and it didn't matter to him that he focused less on performance than presentation. Once an aide suggested Reagan should stay out of the news until a particularly nasty controversy could blow over. Michael Deaver, his image maker, said, "Oh no, let's just get that smiling face on television. That's all we need to do." But behind the image making, there was the reality of the Iran-Contra scandal and a quadrupling of the national debt and deficits, as they say, as far as the eye could see. But Reagan's presidency was almost over before the public focused on things like that, and before the press focused on it. and a case may be made that the media is partly responsible for failing to give greater attention to both the scandal and the debt. Most people will agree, I think, that our political system is plagued with serious problems today, and the outlook for dealing with those problems is bleak if the younger generation stands aside and scorns politics, as many young people seem inclined to do today. Only 28% of college freshmen today keep up with politics, compared to 60% in 1966, according to a recent study by the UCLA Education Research Institute. And I think we in the news media should be especially concerned about that, because we are part of the problem. Several studies have recently shown that we are. The most recent one by Harvard's Joan Shorenstein Center for Press and Politics directly links young adults' increasing lack of interest in news and politics to the media's emphasis on soft news and negative or critical journalism at the expense of hard news and solid investigative reporting. The report noted that negative coverage of politics has risen dramatically in recent decades, with negative coverage of presidential candidates now exceeding positive coverage. By 1980, negative coverage of Congress and its members was over 80%. Each president since 1976, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton, has received more negative coverage than his predecessor. Also, during 1990-95, not a single cabinet-level agency received more positive than negative coverage. As portrayed by the press, America's public leadership is almost universally inept and self-serving, according to the Harvard report, which also noted that the pressures of today's 24-hour news cycle discourages high-quality investigative reporting. As a consequence, most of the negative content is supplied through journalists' use of sources rather than deep investigation. When a politician makes a statement or takes action, reporters turn to adversaries to attack it. The critical element is supplied not by a careful assessment of the claim or action, but by the insertion of a counterclaim. I think the report's most damning indictment cited a pronounced tendency to report what is wrong with politics and politicians at the expense of ever reporting what is right. A type of reporting, quote, nearly ideological in its premise, according to the report. Most politicians are presumed to be incompetent, venal, or deceptive, and it is the journalist's role to let everyone know that's the way it is. With the press so negative about politicians, reporters who try to be fair and even-handed find that some of their colleagues caught up in the pack journalism of negativity accuse them of pandering in order to gain access. When Bill's Content asked Bill Clinton to name a journalist who gets things right and explains things well, he said it will kill him. He would never get the Pulitzer Prize if I did it, but it's Brownstein. Of course, he was talking about Ron Brownstein, the Times' widely admired Washington political correspondent, who indeed has been nominated for a Pulitzer for his superb political commentary last year. Brownstein takes politics seriously as a battle of ideas to determine the course of the nation, not a mere contest over offices and power. And he takes politicians and their agenda seriously. When asked about Clinton's comment, Brownstein showed why he has so much credibility and why he's so widely read. He said he had built a good relationship with Clinton, just as he had with George W. Bush and others, quote, by trying to think through what they were trying to do, put it in a larger context, and take them seriously as political actors. If you portray these guys as pushing an agenda in part because they believe in it, it leads to a good relationship. It also leads to good journalism. I don't think we need to stop raising questions about political motives or let up on solid investigative reporting, but I think we do need more reporters with Brownstein's approach. The press needs to follow an adversarial approach in covering politicians, as it always has, but it shouldn't be steeped in negativity nor so cynical about motives that a politician's agenda doesn't get a fair airing. In closing, one other thing seems clear to me. Young people can make a difference in our politics and in our journalism. But the changes I've discussed today mean that those who do get involved will surely have their work cut out for them, whether in politics or in journalism or in communications generally. They will need to know enough about how the system works and apply well-established political or journalistic principles to make it work for democracy and not at cross purposes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. And before I open it to questions, let me just ask one or two of my own. Generally, the gist is that things are much worse now than they used to be. So I just would say, let's focus on Jack Kennedy. Were we better off not knowing that Jack Kennedy tried to get the mafia to kill Castro, or that Jack Kennedy had affairs with women who had mob connections or had a disorderly life that endangered national security? I mean, was that, admittedly, we go overboard now, but the way we protected...
But should we have known about that? Yes, I think we should have known about that. I don't think there's any question about that, because that was something that could easily have affected his presidency, and I think it was very dangerous. It's too bad we didn't know about it, though. I mean, if the press had known about that, I think they would have published that. But we would have been much better off knowing it, no question.
But wasn't there a time of a much cozier relationship when...
Oh, there was.
Yeah.
No, there was no question about it. And there were things that people found out that they didn't publish. You can almost trace going into the private lives back to Wilbur Mills in the early 1970s. He was an Arkansas congressman who was the chairman of the House, of the very powerful House Ways and Means Committee, and he was out with a stripper named Blaze Starr, I think it was, who was dancing at the Junkanoo, and they had a little wreck and fell into the tidal basin in Washington. The police showed up, and that's the only reason that was in the news. The police showed up, but I think from that time on, the press began looking a little bit more closely at the politicians and some of their personal conduct. Personal conduct, that, by the way, that might affect the way they operated the job. One of the persons, of course, who was known to get drunk an awful lot was the House Speaker, Carl Albert, and sometimes on the House floor. Nobody ever wrote about that, and I think they probably should have. Today, they would write about that.
Okay. So now, also, we have a sort of neat division that people in print are responsible and people in electronic, I didn't say you said this, but electronic media are irresponsible, the internet and so forth. You're looking at the treatment of Clinton. If you look at the Los Angeles Times, they did the Troopergate. They fell, your paper, our paper, fell in with right-wing conspiracy theorists and all sorts of stuff. I mean, why did they do it?
Well, I think it was a mistake. I happen to be involved in that story. It's a rather long, involved story. You may know the story.
Oh, a little bit, but
yeah. Well, it's a little bit complicated, but I'll try to tell you what happened. The story was that there were two reporters working on the Troopergate story. Most of you know what the Troopergate story is, I guess. The troopers in Arkansas allegedly had been procuring women for Clinton when he was the governor of Arkansas. And we had a reporter in the Washington Bureau and one in L.A. who were working on this story. And I was the Washington Bureau chief. I didn't happen to know that the story was in the process, but when they finished with the story and turned it in Los Angeles, the editor, Shelby Coffey, said, "Have you run this by Nelson in the Washington Bureau?" And they said, "No, they had not." And they said, "Well, they can run it by him." So they ran it by me, and I read it. And I said, "Well, this is a pretty powerful story. What do we know about these troopers? Are we absolutely positive that the troopers can be believed?" And they said, "Well, as far as I said, well, what's the background?" I said, I would really check into their background. If nothing else, I'd at least get a credit report on them, and maybe even ask them to take a lie detector. In any event, there was a lot of pressure to run this story because the American Spectator, a really right-wing organization, was also working on it, and it was pushing the Los Angeles Times reporters to get this story in the paper so it would give their own story some credibility. If it was only in this conservative publication, it would not have much credibility. CNN was also working on the story. In fact, Tom Johnson, the head of CNN at the time, called me up to ask me, were we running the story? And I said, well, we're checking out some facts first. And I thought we were checking out facts. The fact was that finally they gave in to the pressure in Los Angeles. They ran the story without checking on the background of the troopers. And the next day, the New York Times came out and ran a story which said that the two state troopers had been guilty, and it was a matter of record, had been guilty of lying on oath in an insurance fraud case. So I had always thought that we shouldn't run that story unless we absolutely were convinced that the troopers were credible. I didn't find them credible.
Which segues into another issue that we deal here with a lot, which is the profit motive and the competition for markets and for readers and so forth. And even respectable newspapers are under that kind of pressure to keep up their share of market and so forth. And now we see increased concentration of ownership. Do you think there are some warning signs there? I mean, now you work for the Chicago Tribune, not for the Chandlers. And you got AOL buying Time Warner and owning CNN and so forth. What is your view of where we're going with media concentration?
Well, I don't like the media concentration. I mean, I think it's much better to have more independent voices out there. I don't I don't see any let-up in that sort of mergers, though, for economic reasons. The more these larger organizations find they can swallow up the other organizations and make better profits, the more they're going to do it. So I don't see any end to it. But I don't think it's a good thing for journalism generally.
Okay, and I have one final question. Many people believe the media has a liberal bias. And when I referred to you before as a liberal Southerner, I didn't mean really that kind of liberal, but really sort of an anti-segregation. I don't know what your politics are, but
you mean comparatively.
I meant you weren't a racist, despite being a Southerner. So we used to consider that a liberal Southerner.
That's pretty well damning me with praise, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I'm just talking about your generation. It was a pretty low standard of what we wanted from the South. Was they weren't in favor of lynching, and then, as I say, a whole new generation of writers came out of that.
Well, yeah. Let me just say one thing, Bob, about that. I think this is a racist society, not nearly as racist as it used to be. But I don't think the South is any more racist than the rest of the country. Where there's a large population of blacks or other minorities, there is more discrimination, whatever part of the country it is. In 1961, I went up to the Boston area, lived in Belmont, and I was on a Neiman Fellowship at Harvard in 1961-62. And I found racism up there in 1961-62 to be just as bad, if not worse, in the Boston area as it was in Atlanta. As a matter of fact, in Atlanta, we were desegregating the schools, and we were doing it peacefully because at that time we had a mayor who called it a city too busy to hate. Now, I'm not saying that things were great in Atlanta. I'm just saying that if you looked at Atlanta and you looked at Boston, the Boston area was just as bad or worse. And I lived in Belmont, Massachusetts, which was a suburb of Boston, which was an all-white town, which did not let blacks live in the town. I went into the barber shop there to get a haircut, and the guy heard my southern accent and said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Atlanta." He said, "How's your nigger problem there?" And I said, "Well, you know, we're a city, you know, that's desegregating peacefully, and I don't think we have a racial problem there." He said, "Well, I'll tell you one damn thing: we don't let them live in Belmont." He said, "A doctor tried to move in the other day, and we didn't let him move in." So it's not just the South. There's a racial problem in the country, but it's coast to coast.
I didn't mean to demean you. What I meant is, in terms of the liberal bias of the media, which is generally asserted and so forth, you offered a few examples where the media was actually kinder to conservatives, like Reagan, and seems to be now to Bush as opposed to Clinton. Pretty rough on Jimmy Carter. And I just wonder what you think of that characterization, and in particular in relation to economic issues, which almost never get discussed. But just in the last few years, we had the Telecommunications Act passed, a very important piece of legislation, 96, hardly covered, certainly not covered as a controversial matter. We had the Financial Services Modernization Bill, which allowed banks, stockbrokers, and insurance companies to get together, changing 65-year policy, hardly covered, and again, not covered as a matter of controversy. So I'm just wondering, do you think there is a liberal bias?
Oh, I think there absolutely is no liberal bias. I mean, that is something that has really taken hold in this country, coming from right-wing sources. And the ironic part about it is that if you look at the media, most of your columnists are really conservative, and some of them far out conservatives. And if you look at your television, you don't see any really liberalism there at all. And you only have one network station that has any sort of ideological focus to it at all, and that is Fox, which is far right. So, I mean, the right wing has managed to plant that idea that there's a liberal bias to the media, and they're the ones who are on the phone all the time. If you get on C-SPAN, for example, a call-in show, all you get is call-in from these right-wingers who say, "I know you're this liberal guy from so-and-so." It's amazing to me how they've made this story stick, because there's not an iota of truth to it.
Questions?
Well, I think that there should be a uniform system of voting in the country, and I think it ought to be, you know, carefully thought out and put in place. And if electronic voting turns out to be the best way to make sure you have accurate voting and everybody's voting counts, then I think it should be that. Whatever they come up with. I noticed I didn't read that story, but I think I saw the headline on it. It said it will take a decade for them to put it in place. Sounds like an awful long time to me for them to get it together. I think they should have it together by certainly in time for the next presidential election.
Questions?
Right. Well, I mean, I can only tell you what I think about it. You know as much about it as I do. I haven't covered what the Wall Street Journal referred to today as his ugly exit from the Oval Office. I was astounded at it. I couldn't believe that he would do that. And I'm sure that President George W. Bush is right when he says he'd like to get it behind him and get on with whatever his agenda is, because Clinton is hogging all the headlines with both the pardons and his trying to get this office space in New York and the gifts that he had to give back and everything else. I was astounded that he did that, and I think it's certainly not helping his legacy, and it's probably not helping his wife's term in the Senate beginning either.
But you know what, on that note, again, the question whether we treat other people the same way, was it Caspar Weinberger was pardoned?
Right.
The whole scandal up in the Bronx involved, I think, Ed Meese got pardoned. I forget all the details, but there have been a lot of suspicious pardons before. I don't even recall. The only one that was really examined, I guess, was Ford's pardoning Nixon.
Right.
But when Weinberg and those guys got pardoned, and I don't recall there being a whole lot of attention to it. Wasn't it always assumed the pardon was something you did that wouldn't have otherwise take place, and you probably did it for political reasons?
Well, that's true. That's true. But I don't think you can defend Clinton's pardons, though. I mean, Clinton's pardons have been pretty...
Well, I was curious about the one the L.A. Times went to town on this drug case. The L.A. Times had a big story, you know, he pardons this drug deal. Then you look at it, the Cardinal wrote on behalf, leading congressmen, leading Latino figures, the Speaker of the Legislature. You look at it, it was a who's who of life in Southern California, people who for 5 years had asked for this guy to be pardoned.
Well, that's true, but I think the fact that Clinton did all these pardons just before he went out of office, that he didn't send them through the Justice Department as they usually do and everything, raised questions about it, and I think legitimate questions about it.
Yeah.
A moment ago, you said you like all but one of the presidents you covered. Would you mind sharing?
Oh, I was sure everybody would know I was talking about Nixon. You remember what Bob Dole said about Nixon when Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan, I guess, were going to the funeral of Sadat. And Dole looked at him and he said, "See no evil, hear no evil, and evil."
Let me just enter.
Go ahead.
No, I just want to say, I know you like Jimmy Carter a lot, and I do like Jimmy Carter, but I have had the nastiest exchange of letters and everything with Jimmy Carter continues to the last month or two, and if I were subjective, I would say he's got a pretty thin skin. On the other hand, I found him before he died, I found Richard Nixon to be a thoroughly interesting, pleasant, intelligent fellow. I interviewed him for the LA Times. So I do think there's a subjective element, and I think in retrospect, if we look back at Nixon's years on domestic policy, he was actually a more moderate and effective than maybe Carter, and certainly.
Well, I wouldn't disagree that he was more moderate and more effective, but he was also more abusive of power. And of the two, I mean, I think you'd have to say that Carter left the country much better off than Nixon did. The trouble with Carter is personality. I mean, you know, he doesn't, like you say, he's probably exchanging these letters with you. They had this sign in the White House press room when he was president. He never talked to the guards or the doorman or anything, or patted anybody on the back, or told people they did a good job or anything. And they had this sign that they kept on the bulletin board over there that said, "Doing a good job around here is like wetting in your pants in a dark suit. It gives you a warm feeling, but nobody pays any attention." That was Carter.
Yeah.
Is there a last feeling for women reporters and people of color? You can still
Well, I would say that it really isn't, but you know, I can't really talk too much about the glass ceiling except to say that you know, I just noticed that the New York Times has elevated its president to president of all of its New York newspapers. The New York Times also has a woman Washington bureau chief now. Newsweek magazine, sometimes I've wondered whether they had any males at all in that bureau, because practically all women are there. And you see a lot, Gannett newspapers particularly has a lot of women publishers and women editors. I think that just generally that journalism is now considered to be, and has been for some time, a good field for women to go into. And they're certainly dominating now in journalism classes in college. This is the third year I will have been teaching a seminar in Washington for students from Southern Cal who come there with internships. And all of my students this year, there are 10 of them, are female. This is the third year, like I say, and we will have had a total of 33 students, 3 males out of 33. And one of the students this year said that some of the journalism students now are looking on the profession as a female profession, and they're even thanking the males for staying there. So there are more and more women who are entering the field, and I think part of the reason is that they see opportunities and that there isn't that glass ceiling. Well, I don't think that's true of color either, but there are not nearly as many people of color in journalism, and it's not, by the way, I don't think because newspapers and radio and television haven't really tried. I mean, I think they've tried and they have not succeeded very well. In fact, I had a young African American student here just yesterday after one of our classes stop me and say, you know, one reason that blacks do not want to go to journalism school because they've been treated so shabbily by blacks for so long, and they don't see it as a place where they were welcome. And that may very well be true. But I think that it's also true that the news media actively is trying to recruit more minorities and wants to do that. And there are a number of programs involved in it. The Los Angeles Times has its own recruitment program. I mean, and I'm sure that they've made some success in it.
Well, if I can offer a dissent on this, I think it's still an old boy network. If you go to the American Society of Newspaper Editors, it's about 98%, 95% men on that podium. And I think in terms of who gets into the business, it's still networking and who, you know, bringing in a friend, bringing in someone you know. And a lot of white people don't have black friends. A lot of white men are more comfortable with men than they are women professionally, and I think you really see it. I mean, we have Terry Anzer here on the faculty, who's a great television reporter, and she's being pushed out of the local market. Why? Because, and she's a gorgeous looking woman, but they say she's getting too old, and she's with that Hal Fishbein, who's like a prune. He's so old, and so I think if you actually look at, I mean, the reality out there, I think there's still a great deal of institutional barriers, glass ceiling. But there are potential lawsuits. I mean, after all, one of the reasons it came down was a fear of lawsuits, like the New York Times lawsuit.
No, that's true. There's no question about that. But I don't agree with you, though, that there is that much of a resistance to women anymore, or to minorities for that matter. I think it's true, as you say, when you've got that many whites who have been entrenched for that long, who do not have minority friends, that they're not as likely to be bringing them in. Although, if you look at every major news organization, you will see that they all have minority recruitment programs and that they're working on it.
Could you describe a little bit from your experience the personal sources of power that maybe Clinton and one other president used, and how they may be different from one another, just their own personal life?
On how they might be different from one another. Yeah, well, let me take Reagan as opposed to Carter. There are only 2 institutions in Washington that the president really has to be able to learn to deal with. You know, I mean, 2 main institutions anyway, if you're not talking about the special interest. I mean, you know, they are Congress and the press. That's who they really, a president's got to deal with. And the difference in the way those 2 dealt with the press and the president was just absolutely amazing. And I have to give you personal anecdotes to explain what I mean. I had known Carter, like I say, since he was state senator. covered him as state senator, covered him as Georgia when I was an Atlanta Constitution reporter, covered him when he was presidential campaign, covered him when he was president. Lined up an interview with him and went in, and all he could do was look at his watch and say, this has got to be the last question, this has got to be the last question. I went in to interview Reagan, and even though I covered him and was Washington bureau chief of his hometown newspaper, he never had the slightest idea who I was. But he was extremely nice to me, and I brought in 2 other reporters with me to be involved in the questioning. And he went on for the 30 minutes, and Larry Speaks was the press secretary at the time, and he began to give us the cutoff sign at 30 minutes, and so I asked the president a 2-part question, and he talked for about another 5 or 6 minutes. And then Speaks was kind of going crazy because we were way over time, and he says, well, wait a minute, nobody asked me about it, and I forget what it was now. And I said, well, Mr. President, I'm asking you now. So he answered that question. We stood up, he turned to Dick Cooper, our bureau, and he said, you didn't ask me a question. So he asked him a question. So we wound up staying 15 minutes overtime. You know, we got a good interview and felt good about it. Well, I mean, the contrast with Carter was just unbelievable. I had to get out of it just right away. Now, talk about his dealing with Congress. I called up Carter one time. I didn't call up Carter, I take it back. I called up Jody Powell, and I told him, his press secretary, and told him I was working on a story about the Vice President Mondale not being as strong a vice president as Carter said he would be. And he said, well, have you talked to the boss about it? And I said, well, of course I haven't, you know, because I didn't have any access to him. And he said, well, I'll have him call you. Well, he did have him call me. And he began to tell me when he talked to me that, yes, Mondale was a very strong vice president, and he knew more about the Middle East and arms control than he did, and etc. And I thought I'd get a little bit more out of him while I had him on the phone. I said, by the way, Mr. President, members of Congress say when you come in there, you give them the brush off. You don't give them any time. And he said, they waste my time. I know more about the issues than they do. Well, I mean, that was his attitude toward Congress. Reagan, when members of Congress went in to see him, he regaled them with Hollywood stories. He'd keep them for, 15 to 20 minutes overtime. And when they went out, he had them in their pocket. It was just a big difference in the way the two of them dealt with Congressmen. Well, Clinton really, I think more than anybody else, dealt with the public more and went around everybody. I mean, he was so good at dealing with the press. He's the one guy better than Reagan, in my opinion, both in speaking to mass audiences and in speaking on television and in locking eyes with the television viewer. I mean, he was just great with that. And I think that was his most powerful weapon. Well, I guess it's according to what you mean by dignity, bringing it back into the administration. A lot of people didn't think it was dignity bringing John Ashcroft in as Attorney General. I would say this just from the standpoint of style. He did bring in experienced people and people who've been around a little while, and they're efficient. Clinton, when he came in, he brought a lot of younger people in from his campaign, a lot of people from Arkansas, a lot of people who had never been in Washington before. And they were, a lot of them were sort of wearing jeans around the White House. And so from a stylistic standpoint, Bush is probably, although I have to say that even the Clinton White House after a while kind of settled down and changed the style of it somewhat. But my guess is you're not going to have the kind of problems that developed in the Clinton administration.
On the TV show The West Wing, Jed Bartlett, the guy who was the president, was very popular in the American public. People really didn't like him. A lot of reasons because of things he said. He's funny, he's personable. I'm wondering why the two main parties haven't picked up on that and realized that they should have a candidate that has the qualities that people seem to like in television. What's the barrier? What's keeping people from projecting candidates like that?
Well, I guess it's just because they don't have many candidates out there that are that good at it. I mean, remember when Mondale ran for president? He was terrible on TV, and somebody said he needed some coaching, and Mondale said, well, they'll have to take me for the way I am. I'm not going to change. This is the way I am. And, he got defeated, of course. I just don't think you have that many candidates out there that are that adroit projecting on television.
Do you feel that I think the Lewinsky scandal was something that the American public did benefit anything from, like the information about the coverage of that? I mean, Professor Scheer asked you the question about JFK's scandals that kind of surrounded his life, and you thought those were very important to the American people to know that, and it would have been better for us to know that then. But, I mean, I just really cannot find any justification in, like, the year-long coverage and that, and the way it just kind of, like, eventually fizzled away. I mean, I think a lot of that, like, was contributed to President Clinton's charisma around that. People did like him, and it just kind of, that's kind of one of the things that got him off, I think, on that whole thing. But what do you think? How do you feel about that? Do you feel we benefited from that? Or?
Do I feel that we benefited from knowing about the Monica Lewinsky case? I think that we had to know about the Monica Lewinsky case when it happened. I mean, the way it happened. I think that the American people were entitled to know about it. I don't think it deserved the kind of overwhelming coverage that it got, and I don't think it deserved an impeachment inquiry. I mean, I think it was bad conduct on his part, and I think he brought disgrace to the White House. But I don't think we should have given it nearly as much attention, and certainly Congress shouldn't have given it so much attention.
On that subject, what do you think his response should have been when the controversy first came up?
I think he should have said yes. I think he should have said yes, and I think he would have headed off the impeachment. But Clinton couldn't bring himself to do that.
Well, a lot of married men have a hard time.
Regarding that, you made the distinction between the Nixon impeachment and that impeachment, and I think that he wasn't being impeached for immoral activity in his private life. He was being impeached because he made perjured statements regarding it. And I think that the Pardon Richie is just another case of him being above the law and dragging a private citizen under an umbrella of impunity. And I think that's what makes the public angry at everybody from traffic cops to politicians. When they think they're above the law, that's what angers the public and the party.
Well, but the fact was that the perjury you're talking about grew out of the personal conduct, and as Bob just said, not only are people not inclined to admit that they had done something like that, they're not inclined to tell the truth if they talk about it. And I don't think that the American people wanted him to be impeached in fact, all the polls show that on the basis that he lied about sex. And I think that a lot of the Republicans look back on it and realize that it wasn't a thing to do. I mean, it was strictly a partisan thing.
When Larry Fishman did speak to Larry Clinton, I mean, he's talking about how he posted a reward for any mistress or lover of a politician to come forward, and someone did come forward. So there's scandals like this that occur in Washington, and obviously, since it's been publicized so much in the media, I mean, and you're in touch with the political sector out in Washington, is that like are they really, is that helping develop them, not develop their morals, but put their morals and their traditional morals more into the light? I mean, to increasing them kind of find themselves more credible for their actions? Are they really altering their actions now? Are they trying to be morally proper now?
You mean all the politicians trying to be morally proper?
Yeah.
Well, they sure as hell trying not to get caught. I can't say whether they're being more moral or not. I don't know, but we hadn't heard any more comments about any of that happening. So, but my guess is that people are being not just more careful, but maybe even not being involved in as much of that kind of activity.
Yeah, except that the people who went after Clinton, a number of them turned out to be doing that kind of activity.
Oh, that's exactly right.
At the very moment they were giving the speeches. So
exactly right, including Newt Gingrich.
Yeah. So boys will be boys, I guess. Any more questions? Yeah.
Do you think that we should be concerned about Bush bringing a lot more religion into...
Should we be concerned about injecting more religion into politics? Is that it?
Yeah, do you think that
Yeah, I think there's reason for concern about that. The Republicans are trying to reassure people that they don't mean that they're going to be giving money to religious organizations to run any sort of government programs or anything like that. In fact, the Pennsylvania professor who's been named to head up the White House task force on exactly that subject has a piece in the editorial section of the Wall Street Journal today trying to reassure people of exactly that thing, that this is not what we're about. And but I think people ought to be concerned about it and ought to monitor it pretty closely. But, you know, religion has been involved in politics for a long time, and it'll still be involved in politics. It's just that I think it ought to be monitored very carefully to make sure that nobody crosses the line.
Isn't there one person here who believes the LA Times is a pinko, lefty, liberal rag? Because I was at the boat show this weekend and at the LA Times booth, and there were about 20 people at the boat show who were strongly of that view. That the LA Times is just a liberal rag. Is there anyone here who feels that way? And I mean, don't be embarrassed. Huh? Used to be a liberal rag? Left? I mean, but I mean, is this people don't want to talk about it, or they don't think? Or let me ask you another question: how many people here think newspapers have a future? Does anyone want to argue that you do? How many think newspapers have a future? Pretty encouraging. Does anyone want to? We have time for just two more questions. Anyone want to raise some big issues here about whether, you know, where we're going or whether newspapers have a future? Yeah.
I don't want to argue about whether or not newspapers have a future, but one does notice a tremendous gap between the way politics is discussed in prestigious national newspapers, such as the LA Times and the New York Times, and the way politics tends to be discussed, if it's discussed at all, in other forms of media. And one also notes that fewer and fewer of the public are gravitating toward reading the newspaper, and more of them are picking up the news from wherever else they can find it, if they're attending to it at all. So I'm curious how you, as someone who's made this your life's work, sees a way in which we can reinvigorate public interest in the tell political stories so that they're more engaging and appealing.
Well, I mean, that's exactly the kind of question that editors throughout the country talk about all the time, how they can make the newspapers more readable, more receptive to the average reader out there, because you're exactly right. Most of the people get their news about politics and other things from some of these, not only television, but radio talk shows and so forth. But I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you this, though, that the Los Angeles Times is not decreasing its coverage since the being bought by the Tribune Company. It's actually increasing it. It's increased the metropolitan coverage. It's increasing the Washington Bureau coverage. So at least that's one news organization that's trying to move ahead on it. Yes. You mean circulation? Do you know that, Bob? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's gone up recently, and I think more than most newspapers.
You can pretty much get the circulation you want within reason. There's something called a churn. We'll discuss this if you, I don't know if you're in this class, but we discussed it. You can, about half of the subscription to the LA Times, say about 600,000 people, somewhere around that, 700,000 people, love the paper for whatever reason. And they read it and it's important to them. There's another 5, 6, 700,000 people that you're constantly attracting, losing, moving around, hoping to keep. You see the people out there selling you the LA Times if you're here. And the great hope, and there seems to be some evidence, is that people may reject newspapers when they're 19, but then they come to newspapers when they're 29. And they find there's an economy. As Jack said, you go on the internet, you know this from going on, there's a lot of junk out there. The great thing you get from a good newspaper is at least there are intelligent editors there saying this stuff's important enough to put on page 1, this stuff has been checked out, and I think people have found they waste a lot of time. One last question, okay.
Well, I think that's true with a lot of, certainly with the networks it's true. They've cut way back on their foreign bureaus. A lot of newspapers have cut back on the foreign bureau. Once again, the LA Times has not done that, and I don't think they will, but some of the other newspapers have. A lot of them have not had good foreign coverage for many, many years. But the worst thing, I think, is the networks. The networks have cut way back.
So I want to say, don't exaggerate the power of consultants. I've been wearing a brown suit